Let me put it this way. I'd like to think that God is real.
I don't believe in God because the idea that an omniscient, loving being would judge me, who is mortal and ignorant, based on a few years' experience, I find to be rather a cruel thought.
All the power that God has, he, she, it has given to me. So we're definitely one.
I hope there's something else out there. It'd be fun to experience either that or we're all just evolved apes.
I
was raised atheist. I don't believe in a higher power, but I also don't claim to know everything about the world.
I don't know. I don't know if there is one. I just pretend, I guess, and hope that there's something else out there.
Well, good morning once again. If you've found us online, I'm Pastor Tim, and we are continuing our series, Explore God. We kicked it off with 1,000 other congregations all around Chicagoland last week. We talked about purpose. Go online, check out that message. It's a fantastic one, and I believe God is going to bless that if you tune in. And for those who are here today, we're going to continue not just receiving, but dialoguing. I said this last week, I'll say it again this week. We cannot explore God and truly know God apart from the relationships that he has placed around us. And so you can't know God in a vacuum. You just don't wake up one day, it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to explore God by myself. The best way to explore God is with other people. So find some folks around you, and we're just going to kick off our message time. If you're online, you can do it online through the Messenger app or through direct message, the comment area down there. Do this. Turn to folks around you, share your name and your favorite cold winter activity, all right? You cannot say move to Florida. I joke, you can say move to Florida, but because my honest favorite cold winter activity is to pray for summer, all right? So Olaf and I, we have this connection, this bond, all right, in summer. Here's the question where we want to go here today. In that same group, share your response. Is there a God? And if so, how do you know? Is there a God? And if so, how do you know? Take about 30 seconds and just kind of throw some thoughts around, all right? Point of honesty with you, I have not asked that question since college, which for me, it's been about 15 years. We typically don't ask that question on a regular basis, like, is there a God? If you grew up in a Christian home, if you are in a Christian church, which, by the way, that's where you're sitting in right now, it's sort of this assumption, is there a God? The assumed answer is yes. And I mean, we just sort of say that, and what I've learned about the recent generations, the millennials, or I just learned that I'm like Gen X. I'm kind of having this identity crisis because I always thought I was a millennial. So I'm not quite sure what all that means, but our young people too. We grew up, many of us might have grown up in churches, I know I did, where we couldn't ask this type of question because it was assumed like, yes. Why? How do you know? Because we said so. Moving on. Now, I don't know about you, that was kind of my confirmation experience. We'd have this confirmation, faith formation process, and it might have been similar to yours where you're like learning about the attributes of God, like he's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, he's righteous, whatever that means to a 7th grader, and you're sitting there, it's like, can we just go back, like, is there a God, and how do I know? And I remember, and this is not trashing the pastor who taught me, but we just didn't have a good way of talking about it. I remember what he said to our class. He said, we're a Christian church, and that's just how it is. Yes, there is a God, and how do you know? Because I told you so. Parents, how well does that work with kids? Not very good. Not very good. Sometimes we need to take our cue from kids, and I just want to share these letters that children have written to God, kind of in this same vein, okay? Like Allison, she's 7 years old. She wrote this, "Dear God, I read the Bible, but what does begat mean? Nobody will ever tell me." It's true. It's true. Or Frank, "God, I bet it's really hard for you to love everyone all the time in the whole entire world. There's only 4 people in my family, and I can never do it." Or Darla, "Did you really mean do unto others as they do to you? Because if you did, I'm going to go fix my brother." Or Seymour, "Dear God, how come you did all those miracles in the old days, but now I don't see anything?" Or Timmy, who writes, "Dear God, I wish there was no such thing as sin. I also wish that there was no such thing as war." Or Larry, who writes, "Dear God, maybe Cain and Abel would not kill each other so much if they had their own rooms. It works really well with my brother." I don't know about you. I remember writing letters to God when I was their age as well, and it's kind of like asking questions, right? And I don't know about you. I've never received a letter back from God. I've never got anything in the mail. It's not like Santa Claus where like you like dream like something's going to happen, then you see him in the mall. It's like, oh, he is. And so it's not like we have this physical, tangible dialogue with this higher being that we call God. And sometimes for some of us, and I remember when I was younger, really wrestling with this because, God, just give me a sign. Give me an answer. Do something. Maybe you're like that too. Like we just want some evidence to know that God is real. If you have your sermon notes, I put in an insert. You can take those out. And maybe you've been asked that question, hey, is there a God? And if so, how do you know? And you're like, because the Bible says so. Well, that doesn't really cut it. Yeah. So I'm going to give you some pointers for conversation, but also if you're sitting here, if you're listening in, maybe these will be good conversation and reflection points for your devotional life. We have Explore God groups going on throughout the week, so you can hop onto our website, stmarkslife.org/explore God, find a group, and further this discussion. But today I'm going to walk us through 4 really evidences or ways that we can respond. How do we know if indeed there is a God? We would say, yes, there is a God, all right? So you can jot these down. The first one is this. It's through creation. I don't know about you, but I enjoy going on hikes, but when I'm out in nature, like you look around, like even when there's snow on the ground and there's ice and you dream that you were in northern Wisconsin. Yeah. Anyway, we look at God's beauty and it's like, oh my goodness. No human could even dream of this. Or maybe I've had this experience. It's not even in a church setting. You're listening to a concert, whether you like rock and roll or classical orchestra. I remember sitting and listening to a Brahms suite, and I'm like, oh my gosh. The way it all comes together, it's like you're in another world. Stevie Vai, the guitarist, does that for me too. It's like, oh my gosh, what talent that God created, that something outside of themselves has to exist. King David, he puts it like this in Psalm 19. We're going to read it together. It's up on the screen. Together we say, the heavens are telling the glory of God. They are a marvelous display of his craftsmanship. Now, the glory of God, it's sort of the heaviness of God, but let me just get really simple. It's the power and the presence of God. That's what that term, glory of God, means. It's his power, his work, and his presence, him being in that moment. And this is what David is saying. All the heavens, all the creation, everything you see is telling of the power and the reality, the presence of God. because they are a marvelous display of what? His craftsmanship. Now, where else do we hear that word? You fast forward a couple thousand years from David, and you have Paul, all right, who experienced God in a very real way on a Damascus road, and it changed his life from a persecutor and a hater to a lover and a builder of God's church and a teller of truth. And so he writes to the Ephesian Christians, the church in a place called Ephesus, and he says, it's by grace you've been saved through faith, not by anything you've done, so that you and you and you and you and you and you and me, and we can't boast. We can't say, well, I'm better than you and you're better than me. And so, no, the ladder goes out the door. It's by grace that we have experienced the love of God. No matter where you've been, you can experience the love and presence and the power of God. And then he continues. Why? Because you are God's craftsmanship. Because you are also telling the glory of God. Because you and your life are also telling the story of God's power and presence. In creation, just looking at yourself, it's like oftentimes we kind of struggle maybe with self-image, but if we really think about it, all your 100 billion cells that you have in your body work together. I mean, who else could orchestrate that? I don't know, not me. So creation, we can look around and even life itself, and it's telling the story of the power and presence of God, the existence of God. Here's another way. It's through our morality, or we could think about this in terms of ethics. Maybe you're kind of in a philosophy, and that's the way you relate, and sort of a way that you can say, yeah, God exists, and that's how I know. I want to speak with students right now. All right, students, look at me, and you know what this is like, right? If you're in 303 and 304, you know Home Access Center, and you just got your report cards. You know how you did on those final exams, and you kind of get this little knot right about here. You know what I'm talking about, where you know, yep, should study a little more. Yep, should not have stayed up so late. And then, if you're like me, point of honesty, you try to print it off on your computer and you change that C to an A with a black Sharpie, thinking that you're going to trick your parents. That's guilty confession. Yeah. Hey, if a pastor can move from there to here, you can too, okay? God has sanctified me and forgiven me of that sin. But I remember that little knot right about here on the top of your tummy. It begins tightening and moving. You know what I'm talking about? We call that your conscience. All right, or your heart. And this is what the Bible says. Paul, again, he's writing to the church in Rome, all right? And this is what he says. People demonstrate that God's law is written where? On their hearts. It's written in them. For their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or they tell them that they are doing right. So in a way, we know that God exists because there's a sense of right and wrong. If you're a black and white sort of person, all right, you draw the line in the sand, you really resonate with this. Like, there is a God because I know what is right and what is wrong. And what Paul is saying, yeah, that's true, because there's something in you, your conscience, that moral compass that guides and directs that. And no human can really place that into another. You can shape and form it. You can shut it off. You can ignore it. But no matter who you are, you experience right or wrong through your conscience. That's another evidence that God indeed exists. But maybe you don't resonate with that so much. Maybe you're like me. It's like, man, I wasn't super smart in school, but I'm a pretty simple guy. And so logic or intelligence sort of paints that picture, all right? C.S. Lewis, he's a philosopher. He's an author, really, really great writer. Chronicles of Narnia. You familiar with the movie, at least? He wrote the book before it was a movie, and just a fantastic sort of a guy who helps us understand in simple ways who God is. And this is what he writes. He says, humanity is not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. So we don't know what we're craving unless there's something to crave. That's what he's saying. So he gives some examples. A baby feels hunger, so there's such a thing as food. A duck wants to swim, so there's such a thing as water. We feel sexual desire, so there is such a thing as sex. If I find myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, let's be honest, we all have them, right? The most probable explanation is what? Let's read it in yellow. I was made for something or someone else. In a way, Jerry Maguire was right. Someone else completes you. St. Augustine, before C.S. Lewis even lived, he wrote that we all have a God-sized hole in our lives, in our hearts, and we are not at rest, we are not complete, we are not satisfied until we fill that with God. A little bit about Augustine. He was a broken guy. He struggled with temptation, with women. He went around and he was a liar. He was a cheater. He would actually trick the government, kind of like get out of his taxes. I mean, just not a good guy. And we call him a saint because of the contribution he gave through that one sentence. And then he went on to elaborate on that in his book called The Confessions. And really what he's saying is that you and I, we go through and we seek these desires to fill our lives. Maybe it's with money, maybe it's with food, maybe it's with relationships, maybe it's with whatever you are craving and seeking, and you go from one thing to the next, to the next, and the next, and you're never satisfied. And what he's saying, just like what C.S. Lewis is saying, perhaps there's something that you are missing that only God can give, which is an evidence that there is a God who exists. But maybe you don't resonate with any of those, creation or morality and ethics or just logical intelligence. Maybe there's something else, and that's where I want to go here for the rest of our message time today. In the Gospel of John, there is a story of Jesus, all right? John chapter 2, and it tells us of really the fourth evidence that we know God exists, and it's that four-letter word. Let's say it together. Love. Love. You don't need to go there here today. I'm just going to walk us through the story. In John chapter 2, Jesus is coming here to a place in Cana, all right? There's a wedding celebration, and it begins here, chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana. So what happened in the first day and second day? So the first day, Jesus is baptized, and then he goes and asks his disciples, a couple of his disciples, to come follow me. So Matthew and Peter and James and John, come follow me. And they do. And the second day, he goes and asks Philip and Nathanael, come follow me, and join Matthew and Peter and James and John, and we're going to experience a belonging and acceptance, the power and the presence, the glory of God, like you've never dreamed of. So they're there at the wedding, and the end of the first verse says, they were there with the mother of Jesus, whose name is Mary, right? So it's a family gathering. Weddings were a little different back then. It wasn't a 45-minute service with a 3-hour party and then everybody goes their own way. This would have been like a week-long celebration where people would gather and you'd eat and drink and eat and drink and eat and drink and probably eat and drink some more. And you can imagine just the day after day after day party experience in Palestine. And that's what Jesus walks into with his mom there, and this is probably a relative of his, some connection, maybe a cousin. We don't know. But Jesus, he was invited to the wedding, and he brings his disciples. It was kind of like his plus 12, all right? There were already a bunch of people there, so it really didn't matter. Verse 3, the wine runs out. Everybody say, uh-oh. We all know what happens when a party's going on and the wine runs out. You go get Winking Owl from Aldi. Or you go get $3 Chuck from Trader Joe's. Like, you know, $3 Chuck, $3 bottles of, yeah. $2 Chuck. They lowered it. All right. I know where I'm going after church. So anyway, the wine runs out. And this is not good because the party has to keep on going. Just an aside, a wedding, maybe you've never thought of this, maybe you didn't grow up in the church and made this connection, but think about a wedding is kind of like the picture of heaven. This is one of the themes in the Bible that we as Christians sort of connect. When we go to a wedding, the ceremony is kind of like that entrance into heaven. You have the bride and the groom, they come together, and everything is glorious. The two become one. It's kind of like how we become one with Jesus when we enter into those pearly gates, and everything, you know, if you're married or have been married, you remember the days like, oh, it's like ecstasy, like, oh, perfect. I never want this moment to end. And And then the celebration is kind of like the heavenly celebration that goes over and over and over again. It's actually what we believe communion is when we receive communion. It's kind of like that foretaste of what heaven is like when we're all gathered around. It's like we have this moment, but the moment never ends, all right? And so that moment does end because they're out of wine. And Mary, she by this time, she kind of knows something's up with Jesus. She might not know, like, Mary, did you know? I don't think she knew. But she goes up to Jesus because she knows there's something a little different. She's like, hey, Jesus, they're out of wine. Jesus is like, I'm not going to go out to Trader Joe's, or I'm not going to go down to Aldi and pick up more wine. Like, what do you want me to do? Literally, he says, woman, what does this have to do with me? And then he follows that up with these words, my hour has not yet come. The time is not yet here to give evidence of who I am. And so his mother, she turns to the servants and says something pretty kind of sassy, in my opinion. She says, hey guys, do whatever he says. Now, if Jesus was in the room in a bodily form and he just says, it's not time yet, you'd probably say the same thing too. It's like, okay, he's Jesus. Do whatever he says, and everything's going to work out great. So that's what the servants do. As Jesus is sitting there, he sees these jars, 6 jars. And this is how the story goes. There were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rite of purification. So it's kind of like taking the chalice that we used for the Lord's Supper that we just shared, using something sacred. And that's what he sees. Each holding 20 or 30 gallons. So these are huge, huge jars. Jesus said to the servants, go fill the jars with water, and they did. And then he said, go draw some out, take a glass of the wine to the master of the feast. And so they took it. And the master of the feast, the master of ceremonies, takes a sip. And this is what he says. Check it out. Everyone serves the good wine first. Why? Because it's good wine. Period. It's good wine. And when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. Common sense. But this is what he realizes. Let's read that last sentence together. But you have kept the good wine until now. The evidence of God is now being made known in the love of God that is providing the best wine at that moment. It's in a way God, all this time, has been saying, look around at creation, you can see that I exist. Look at your conscience and you can see a side of me and know that I exist. Look at your logic and your reason and you might know that I exist. But now I'm going to show you the best way, above all the other ways that I indeed exist. It's going to be through my love. Like all those things, they're good. But in this statement, you have kept the good wine until now. God has kept the best way of knowing that God exists until this moment, until this miracle, until the demonstration of the power and presence of God in the provision of not just the wine, but the provision of his Son who goes to the cross, who forgives your sins, who washes away your past, who reconciles your brokenness, who comes back to life and gives you an opportunity to live differently. He says the best way is right now. Look at me. The good wine has been kept until now. The best way of knowing that God exists begins now. And this is how he continues. This, the first of his signs, John, the brother of Jesus, writes, Jesus, my brother, did at Cana in Galilee. And what? Manifested his glory. He made known the power and presence of God. He made known that God indeed exists. But here's the last sentence that kind of gets to me, and maybe it'll get to you too. Let's read the last sentence together. And his disciples believed in him. I believe that sometimes we sort of fake ourselves out and think that doubting or not having the answer to that first question that we asked, is Does God exist? Well, yes. And then how do we know? I'm not sure. And then we sort of discount whether or not we believe in God or not. And then we kind of have this crisis. And then some of us, we actually begin giving up, being like, well, if I can't explain it, maybe God doesn't exist. And we check out and we just kind of go through life. Let me tell you, the disciples didn't have a clue after this. You can imagine, okay, water into wine. What just happened? And maybe you've had an experience like that, like God hits you and something happens. Maybe it's the loss of a job. Maybe it's the loss of a loved one. Maybe it's a repositioning in life. Maybe it's a disease that you have received, and like you're healthy and you're like, what just happened? And yet through those horrible experiences, you see glimpses and glimmers and evidences of God everywhere. Whether it's through medicine, whether it's through logic, whether it's through your conscience, where you just know this is the right next step. You don't really know why, but you just do it. And then it turns out, wow, it didn't even do in a physical human way what it was supposed to do, but like you were actually led closer to God in some spiritual way that you didn't have the wildest dream of when you chose to do it. Friends, that's what's happening here with the disciples. Belief is different than doubt. I'll say that again. Belief is different than doubt. No questioning, the disciples still had a lot of doubts. You can read their story throughout the rest of the story of John. And the disciples are doubting everywhere, and yet it's this word, believe. They believed in him. What does that mean? They had a trust that even when they didn't have the answer to why God might have existed, you say, I trust that God does exist, that he is for me and not against me, that he provides for me even when I don't think that there's anything left, and indeed that he saves the best for now. In the story of Jesus, who has loved you and has died for you, who he gives to you his life. So here's how I want to end. Go back into your groups where you started, okay? And just respond to this question. We won't take very long, but just respond to this question. Share some thoughts. How would the world, and whatever you would translate that to be, the world at large or your home, maybe it's your own personal life, maybe it's your family, how would the world be different if you lived as if God was always with you? Go ahead and spend a few moments there and we'll close up. What's incredible to me is that God's craftsmanship in you and me and how he's created the world, there's so many ways that we can know that God exists. Maybe for you it's creation, and you look around at the beauty of the world and the way you experience life, it's like, yeah, there has to be a God. Or maybe it's the ethical, moral compass, like there's a right and a wrong, and it's for you, it's just clear cut. And that for you is just evidence like, yes, there's a God. Or maybe you're like me, it's just logical, like it just makes sense, and you're a simple woman, you're a simple man, you're a simple person. And it's like, yeah, it just makes sense. Maybe you're like me where you see the life of Jesus, and you see the love that God has for his world, for people, that outside of ourselves, as we cry, Lord, I need you, that he actually shows up. That just like at the wedding at Cana, he shows up. That in the moment of great grief and loss, he shows up. That in the moment of confusion, he shows up. And for most of us, maybe many of us, we have stories of how God shows up in the encouraging words of a person maybe you just met. Maybe it's the words of somebody you've known for a long time. Maybe it's just opening the scriptures and you read that random verse. It's like, wow, I really needed that today. I know that happens to me a lot. But it's the love of Jesus, for me at least, which is the strongest, the best evidence that God exists. So the band's going to come up. We're going to close out, and I'm going to pray here and lead us into a response time, all right? So we bow our heads, and collectively, we just say, God, thank you for being here. Sometimes that question is intimidating. Are you real? And we say by faith, because we can't always explain how and why, but by faith, we say we believe that you are. Even with all the questions and maybe even the doubts, we can still confidently with the disciples say, yeah, you exist. Because of your creation, because of our conscience, because of just logic that you give to us. Above all that, the best way we know is through the power and the work, the life, death, and resurrection of your Son, Jesus. God, for those who are walking through the valley of the shadow of death, for those who are in need of comfort, we ask that you would remind them that you are real. God, for those who are wrestling with diseases, who are in need of healing, God, may we experience your power and presence in a very personal way in our bodies. For those seeking direction, for those starting a new semester, for those continuing their classes, those heading back to school, God, may our intellect and our knowledge and our moral compasses be shaped by what we receive in those spaces that demonstrate that you do exist. God, for those who on this weekend celebrate life, and we do celebrate life here in this space, in all of its forms, God, may you replace fear with joy. May the truth of your life and joy be real for us. May that joy and truth lead us to respond with open hands and open hearts. In Jesus' name we pray.